Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight. We're so happy to have you with us. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight Bindiya Vakil, and you will get a better introduction of her in just a moment, but she is the founder and CEO of a very interesting supply chain software company that really looks at critical issues that we've been facing with the pandemic, the recent issue in the Suez Canal. What is supply chain risk and how do companies deal with that? So we're very, very excited to have her with us today. Now, just as a reminder, she would love to have your questions. So throughout the session, feel free to type your questions in on the app. So you can just click ask a question below your video and type that in, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So thanks again, and I'm going to turn it over to John Patrick, and John Patrick is going to do an introduction for us. Thank you, John Patrick, and thank you, Bindiya, for being here with us.
Thank you, Lisa. So yes, as you've already heard, we are honored to have Bindiya here on behalf of of Resolink, and it is my pleasure to introduce her tonight. She we'll be having a conversation on, as Lisa mentioned, supply chain risk management and disruptions, which is very relevant right now, right? We're all kind of in the midst of a giant COVID disruption, and we've also seen some current events that are disruption related and that she'll hopefully be able to speak to us on. She is the CEO and founder of Resolink. She's been credited with bringing supply chain risk management into the mainstream. And she's one of the founding members of the Global Supply Chain Resiliency Council. She has a master's degree in supply chain from MIT and is also on the advisory board of MIT's Center for Transportation and Logistics. She is Supply and Demand Chain Executive's first Supply Chain Woman of the Year. Bindiya, welcome.
Thank you for having me, John Patrick and team. Appreciate your time today. And everyone, thank you for listening and participating. And as Lisa said, please do send questions. And I will not only try to address them all here, but I'm happy to get back to you offline as well.
Well, thank you, Bindiya. So I figure the way that we'll do this, we're going to have a little bit of a fireside chat. So I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you first. For those in our audience who don't know, would you mind giving us a little bit of background of your company? What is Resolink? What do you do? What services do you provide?
Yeah, absolutely, and happy to. So for those of you who have exposure or experience with supply chain management, you know that supply chain is all about making sure the right products are available at the right time, in the right quantity, in the right place, and all of that. And risk is anything that prevents exactly that from happening. So any variability in any of those, quantity, place, time, etc., is risk, and that can happen from any number of different things. It could be a quality issue, a supplier issue, a geopolitical issue. So in order to manage that variability of supply chain performance, you need a bunch of data. And this data does not reside within your firewall, within your four walls. You are part of an ecosystem. You are buying from suppliers worldwide. So you need to have information about exactly where your parts and products come from and what is going wrong in those regions that could prevent your parts from coming in on time. And so that's what Resolink does. We tell our customers what's going on in the world that might affect the supply chain performance and their suppliers, that might in turn affect their ability to be a good supplier to their own customers.
Very good. Yeah, thank you, Bindiya. So why did you decide to found Resolink, and what need kind of did you see in the market?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. A lot of times people think that you have to be a engineer or a techie to start a company. And the good news for those of you who chose a non-engineering path, I am not an engineer. In fact, I tell my team, you don't have to be an engineer. Anyone can start a company. An 8-year-old can start a company. All you need is to know something that you believe in and are passionate about, and you have the ability to influence people and get them to follow you. I started Resolink after working in supply chain sourcing and procurement for many years, and always felt like, that game Whack-A-Mole where the thing pops up and you whack it. So procurement feels a little bit like that, because there's always an issue. There's always a disruption. There's always you're chasing parts, solving problems. And it always felt like that. Until I spent time at MIT, learned about supply chain risk management there. And then after MIT, I went to Cisco, where I actually got a chance to put it in action. And what I learned was that the problem of supply chain risk, this Whack-A-Mole thing, was just because we were always reacting. That thing had to first pop up. But it was a question of data. And if we could know where that thing is going to pop up, we could be better prepared with the thing. And so it's just a matter of, like I said, knowing where suppliers are located, what's going wrong. It does take time when something happens for that disruption to come at you. A lot of times we were very late at reacting, and that was affecting our ability to perform effectively. And so I started Resolink to make that information available. And what I mean by information is, where are my suppliers? Where are my parts coming from? And what is happening in those regions that might affect us?
Very good. Okay, so I'd love to hang out and talk a little bit about that idea of starting Resolink in the first place. So you went from, I guess you were working with Cisco, and then you decided to kind of go out and strike out on your own. So what were some of the challenges you faced there? What were some of the obstacles of being an engineer?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, an entrepreneur, not an engineer.
Not being an engineer. So it was interesting. So I will say that we would always talk about this at Cisco, because we were building these tools in-house, and we were trying to do this. We had the idea of the solution, but we were looking around in the market and saying, how come no one started a company for this? This is such a big problem, supply chain risk management. And so I would always talk about that. I just didn't know that I would be the one to stumble onto and actually do it. And the way for me that it started was that I started talking about with lots of people. Hey, someone should start a company. And then I had someone who was an engineer who got interested and said, hey, tell me about this idea you keep talking about. I said, well, if there was only a way that I, as a supplier, could just put all my information in a secure place and then allow many of my customers to get access to it over time without having to keep repeating this data entry, then all this very valuable information, my customers could access it and use it to work collaboratively with me on this platform. And we could, from a customer's perspective, I have thousands of suppliers. I want to collect it all in a central place. And then that person started architecting it. So it's a combination of my expertise and knowledge of the problem combined with somebody who has a background in architecting products, but doesn't know anything about supply chain, but you put the brains together and out pops a company. And that's what happened with Resolink, and that's how most companies are started. So when you have an idea, just talk about it to lots of people, because you never know where your co-founder might be. So that's how it started.
Very cool. Very cool. And so I think you did a really good job of describing what some of the needs were, right? What some of these needs you were meeting in the market. Would you say those needs are the same now, or do you think things have changed? Are the customers basically demanding something different now?
So the needs are the same. I think what has happened over the last 10 years is that the market has finally woken up. And, I will say that it's always a challenge, no matter which company or what startup we talk about. The first 3 years, 4 years are extremely challenging. In my case, I was a nobody, no personal brand, no previous experience being an entrepreneur. I'd always worked in very large companies, and the first challenge you face is the day you quit your job and write off your income for however long this is going to take. You don't know at that time. What is the first thing you do? And so I just started talking to a lot of people. Right. And it does take time, it takes on a life of its own too. right? Once the word gets out, you talk to a lot of people. The market changed for us. The root shock for me was, I'd come from MIT, I'd come from Cisco. These companies were very enlightened, if you will, about the need for supply chain risk management. But my rude shock was I went out and I found the world did not care about risk. And that's what the last year has shown us, that we went so far down the globalization and cost savings and lean, but failed to protect our supply chain. And we're seeing that today. And it took me 9 years of pushing before COVID. And we had pockets of disruptions that were actually quite intense for different industries, but nothing like COVID, which was the black swan of black swan. 100% of the population of the world last year experienced personally a supply chain disruption, right? So we all suddenly realized, but I was 10 years ahead of the market. So it took me a very long time to get that awareness created, value proposition realized. How does ROI get created in this, etc. There was a lot of work to be done. And I personally had to learn how to tell the story and explain the return on investment and articulate all of that.
That makes a lot of sense. So why do you think it is that companies appear to sort of ignore these risk factors until there is a crisis? Because I think you're totally right. At this point, it's not hard to make the case for supply chain risk management, but I think it has been for a long time. Well, what do you think it is that, makes it hard for people to kind of, grab onto it before the event happens?
Yeah, there's, I will tell you, our incentives are messed up in supply chain and procurement. And in this was in my life in procurement, I saw this in action too, is, there's a crisis, one person's playing the hero, saving the day, and 6 months later, that person gets a promotion for saving the day. Well, what's the incentive to not have a crisis? If the crisis results in a promotion, we send these bad messages as leadership teams all over the place. And there is no incentive that is set up to doing the right thing, to being resilient, to having a long-term view, and to setting up a project for managing risk. So this is where it starts, is from the top. Risk, by the way, always starts from the top and flows down. And so it's the leadership, the board of directors, the customers of the company that make this a mandate. Hey, how are you protecting our revenue, our interest, our customers, our continuity of supply? So it starts from there, and then the incentives. How are the bonus plans structured? Is risk part of our top 5 initiatives in the company? If not, these things are sending a message to the company that risk is not that important. It's nice to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. It's kind of the whole idea of cost avoidance versus, cost savings. But we talk about this in class a little bit. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't take this opportunity to pick your brain on the current state of supply chain risk, because as you've mentioned, we're in the midst of maybe the biggest disruption, certainly of our lifetime, right? But there's a lot of other things that are currently, kind of in the popular press. So I'm thinking right now, I've had a lot of questions in my classes about the Suez Canal and kind of what the fallout is of that. And I'd love to hear your view on that. What would you say, or what do you think is, how have you seen the fallout of this event? And maybe what are some of the lessons we can learn?
Yeah, so the Suez Canal, almost the last straw in an already crazy year. The largest disruption of our lifetime was happening last year. The demand went up in some things, demand went down in some things, force majeurs, bankruptcies, largest hurricane season, a container shortage, the Texas freeze from 5-6 weeks ago resulted in a plastics disruption because of all the chemicals and intermediate products that are processed there. There's a container shortage going on as well. All that on top of the largest semiconductor shortage in history that is actually still in progress right now, that has shut down a lot of automotive companies, a lot of other industry, a lot of other companies as well have been going through allocations and lines down. Now, in this, multiple ripples on top of ripples comes a Suez Canal shut down, The industry did not need that. Here's what happened. 340 plus ships got stuck last week, waiting. Some 25 routed through Cape, so that's a 4-week delay. So here's the ripple effect of that, right? One is, thank goodness, only a week, because when they started talking about a 3-week time frame, remember there was a 2 to 3 week prediction. We came up with best case, worst case, and the 2 to 3 week case scenario. And in the 2 to 3 week scenario, the world would have changed. Let me put it that way. The world would have changed. We skirted a massive disaster by the fact that this was just 1 week. And even with this just being 1 week, if it was just this thing alone and all those other things were not in play, this would have been, I guess, a blip on the screen. But given that it has come at a time when we have container shortages and all these other things going on, this is a disruption that has 4 months minimum and anywhere from to 12 months to recovery, right?
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because containers going back to Asia getting delayed, which means containers from Asia coming into the US getting delayed. So Europe feels the impact immediately. It goes on to US, and there is a ripple effect over the next.
Okay. Well, wow. Well, thank goodness it was solved so quickly. Yeah.
And here's the other thing, right? We think we're so focused on ocean, but trust me, this affects air freight, because everybody who can economically justify flying products out of Asia into different parts of the world and not having to deal with ocean went and grabbed capacity. So this makes semiconductor shortages worse, because semiconductors fly. So if you're not able to and did not react and grab air capacity last week, which by the way, the price went double, and you might have heard FedEx announce that they weren't going to go back to lower pricing. So that double the 2x the price is here to stay for logistics costs. So it's really, really disrupted. So in terms of financials, right, because that's what we're all about. At the end of the day, how does this affect companies? This is, you might be paying X dollars for raw materials. Now you're going to pay X plus Y%, right? Because your supplier is going short, so you're buying from distributors. Distributors are jack up pricing to maximize their margin during times like these, because the $2 part suddenly becomes $10 because everybody wants whatever you have. So you're paying more for raw material. Your freight expedites that you've been paying $5 million a month for suddenly could become 10 million, 15 million, just depends on mode of transportation. You're going lines down, meaning if you were looking for 100 parts and the supplier said, sorry, no can do, can only do 20 parts, you can't run your line, right? Because you might have already purchased everything else except for this one part the supplier can't sell enough of. So you're sitting on all this inventory, which means your cash just got tied up on all these orders that you already placed. And so your working capital needs just went higher. And this single thing can place some companies into financial distress. And that means bankruptcy risk from your suppliers, which means huge issues, because if one supplier goes bankrupt, I mean, they could be supplying something small, like, you buy something from them for $200,000, $300,000, but they are the sole supplier for a product that you sell for $1 billion in revenue. And now this $200,000 part can jeopardize $1 billion of your revenue. So this is a very, very scary time for supply chain experts. I mean, it has been concerning since COVID started.
Mm-hmm. Right, that makes sense. And that's one of the things when I use your software in our class, it's one of the things we talk about. It is you have that revenue at risk number, so you can understand kind of how this one part might affect your end product, which is really useful. And I think this was something that when I was working with the Navy, we didn't really have that capability. And so that is one of the things that always stands out to me about your software.
So can I talk about that just really quickly? Because I think with your students and alums, You guys, if you go out or when you go out into the world and you work in supply chain sourcing and procurement, you will see this behavior. This is ingrained practice. It's everything is about spend. Hey, I'm going to manage the 20% of my suppliers that are 80% of spend. But that means you are leaving 80% of your suppliers that constitute 20% of spend unmanaged. Now, this is why that is so scary, because if I look at my phone, the little cable connector might be the smallest spend item. I've produced the phone, but I don't have the connector and I can't ship that. If I don't have the packaging, I can't ship that. I don't have the manual, I can't ship that phone. And so when you look at revenue impact, it means, hey, this part, this connector, I use across 5 of my phone models. And so the revenue associated with all those models is the revenue impact of losing that connector. So it is a very critical product. Now, I will tell you my experience is tantalum capacitors. When I started in supply chain in 2020, tantalum capacitors had a 1-year lead time, which meant that we had to place our orders for next year today. You know how costly that part was? 0.01 cents. Okay, and it had a 1-year lead time. The tantalum capacitor shortage was one of the biggest reasons why the 2001 dot-com bust happened. Last year, what brought us to our knees? PPE. You know how much PPE is as a percent of a hospital spend? 3%. So this is the thing, time and time again, we have learned that it's not the expensive stuff that brings us to our knees. It's the small, low spend, high revenue impact stuff, single source, custom, semi-custom. We are not talking to the supplier. We are not paying attention. And that is where the biggest supply chain disruptions happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Bindiya. I totally agree with you. And it's just a fascinating view into the supply chain. I have a student question here that I think relates a bit to this, so I'm going to ask it a little before the student question time. So it says, with a situation like the Suez Canal or the semiconductor chip crisis, obviously a new canal or new factories can't be built overnight. So how do we manage the risk of situations like these in the meantime, while longer term solutions might be years away?
Yeah, and that's again where the revenue impact thing comes in, right? So I completely agree with you. By the way, there is no such thing as risk-free. There is no such thing as risk-free. Even putting up factories in the US does not, in fact, in the Resolink monitoring system, because we monitor disruptions worldwide, last year, it was Texas freeze that brought down the plastics industry, okay? So, and there was the biggest hurricane season that happened. So we've seen multiple disruptions no matter which part of the world you're in. It comes back down to, are you protecting what is most critical? And what is most critical? What affects the highest amount of revenue? So everything we do to protect risk, and I think there was a question about probability and impact. Guess what? Impact is the revenue part, right? Mm-hmm. So you prioritize and protect the stuff that goes on your highest revenue products, the stuff that saves people's lives. If you think about energy infrastructure, telecom infrastructure, all of the stuff that is the critical stuff, not from a spend standpoint, but protect the stuff proactively that goes into your highest revenue products. And yes, that's where you're going to ditch lean, you're going to ditch globalization, because again, that's also where you can justify proactive mitigation. So let me give you this as an example. Okay, you're my boss and I come to you and say, hey, so we spent $200,000 on this part. It's a single source part, and I want to spend $500,000 qualifying a second source. What are you going to say?
That's a lot of money considering how much the part costs.
Exactly, right? But here's now, let me play this back now and say, if we lose this supplier has one site. It's the site that's based in whatever country, region. There's no other site available. This is a sole source part, and it's used on a product that is $4 billion in revenue to our company. I want to spend 500,000 to qualify another. The supplier is financially healthy, but they only have one site. With this 500,000 investment, we'll have a backup site ready to go. Would you reconsider?
Yeah, it does seem the way you pitch it is very important. I mean, this kind of sounds like pitching an entrepreneurial idea, right? You have some experience doing this to investors.
Yes, I do. I have 20 years of experience pitching risk management.
Very good, very good. So actually, I think this kind of relates, and you answered this a little bit, but it's another student question. I think it's relevant here, given what we were just talking about. So how do you balance reducing the probability of a disruption with reducing the impact of the possible disruption? So I guess you're looking at basically impact versus severity. Do you find it's more important to focus on one rather than the other?
Yeah, that's by the way, whoever asked this question, I love this question, because the probability of a disruption, it's the probability of the disruption. What do you have? You can't reduce the probability that an earthquake will happen, or that a factory will have a fire, or that hurricane will happen. That a pandemic will happen. That's the probability. That's the path we're on. The question is, can you reduce the severity and the impact to your business? And let me tell you, this is the bottom line, is how do you do that? It's by making better choices. And when I say making better choices, I know it sounds so simple, but it's the choices we make, who we buy from, right? We can't control whether an earthquake will happen, whether a hurricane will happen, but we can control who we buy from, how much inventory we hold, where do we build this product, do we have a backup site or not, do we hold enough, do we design the product for two sources or just one source, do we jeopardize the supplier cost at the expense of resilience? I mean, these are questions procurement people make these decisions every day. That shapes the severity and the impact of whatever it is that is going to happen. And that is fully within our control. And that's what procurement has to focus on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I keep going over to these student questions because they're so good. Sorry, students. I know we were going to do this later, but I think again this is very relevant. So, what is your opinion on this criticism that lean manufacturing faced last year of being too lean? Do you think that COVID has made companies wary of just-in-time models of manufacturing?
Yeah, and that actually goes back to just what I just said, right? Which is the decision about how much inventory to hold is our decision. Now, did we go too lean? Absolutely, we did. We had a stretched supply chain globally that we then took out all the buffers on, again, without line of sight to what is the revenue impact of making this decision. You can certainly take a lean and JIT approach, but you can't go too far down the road of cutting it on stuff that is critical to running and making your top revenue products, protecting your top revenue products. Again, it's about, you can't be 100% lean and you can't be 100% resilient. It's about finding that optimal happy medium. And we've went way too far on the other side. So the world, again, you're not going to go too far on this side. What we need is to get back in the middle. And the way you get back in the middle is to do a risk assessment based on revenue impact. I won't be lean on these products or these raw materials or parts because they are critical, high revenue impacting, where the supplier has XYZ sites with natural disaster risk, or why, these sites have long recovery times, the supplier doesn't perform very reliably for us. I mean, those types of metrics, you put it all together and you make a well-informed choice to go lean on stuff that is fine, it meets your threshold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of these decisions obviously are now currently being made in the face of COVID, right? So I wouldn't mind just changing gears a little bit here and asking you some questions about COVID, because I think we've danced around it a little bit, but that's the big supply chain disruption that's really kind of happening right now and that we've been living through for the last year. So how have you seen this, how have you seen COVID disrupting supply chains, for one, but also what do you see as some of the lasting impacts? How do you think that our experience with COVID will sort of change the way supply chains operate in the future.
Yeah, gosh, so many things are going to be different post-COVID. It's hard to know which one to start talking about first, right? Because I think COVID made us realize, I mean, professionally, this virtual and widespread adoption of virtual technology itself is a game changer. Everything that could have gone virtual did go virtual and may never come back to being, so I think we as businesses learn how to adapt within that environment. COVID also was a massive wake-up call for supply chain experts and professionals in the finance and supply chain world about the impact that supply chain can have to financials, profits, revenue, margins, etc. And so I think what we will see in 5 years is that, just like IT was the side thing that you did 10 years ago, and supply chain was this cost center thing that you did pre-COVID, supply chain will be right next to the CEO, the CFO. It's one of those key positions in the future. So I think that is the biggest, I think, from a personal standpoint, if you're looking at a career in supply chain. By the way, there has never been a better time to be in supply chain, because you're not going to be managing the fallout of the decisions of the past. You're going to have the opportunity to build the supply chain of the future. We are literally at that transition point today in time where we get to say, where do we want to do business? Look at the map and say, how does this look for our business going forward? I also think this realization, we had pre-COVID things like tariffs and sanctions being issued. Those are just, band-aids to the deeper problems in supply chain, the high reliance on Asia and this massive lean and all reliance on lean and GIT. Look at the Biden executive order that came out at the end of February. What does that say? It's not tackling band-aid. If you put a tariff, let me put it that way. When you put a tariff, everybody just reconfigures the supply chain to avoid the tariff. The tariff was not going to move supply chains out of Asia. All they were going to do is land in Vietnam, put a Vietnam origin, and ship it. It's still built in China, okay? But this review that the Biden executive order talks about, hey, where are your products coming from? What are the risks inherent in those? Are they coming from countries that are not friendly to our interests as the United States? And the government is signaling, like, look at the news that just came out, Intel setting up their 2 wafer fabs in Arizona, right? What the government is signaling is that they're willing to make the big bets. And in supply chain, you have to make big bets, right? You have to bet on countries, on regions, on governments, and those shifts take 20 years to come to fruition. But we have multiple governments now banding together and considering supply chain investments as a key part of their own agenda. And it's not tariffs, and it's not sanctions, and it's deeper and broader. Can we subsidize certain countries? Are certain countries friendly to our interests? How do we make those countries more streamlined to do business in? And how do we incentivize our own states and local governments to provide those incentives, whether it's here, whether in the US, South America, Africa, parts of Asia? We will see those shifts, and we will see more concerted and re-globalized world as a result. It won't be de-globalized, but it will be re-globalized, I should say.
I agree, and I think that Biden executive order is really going to, it'll wake some people up to maybe how little they know about what's going on in their supply chain, right? I think that is another big benefit of it.
Yeah.
But absolutely. All right. So also, kind of carrying on with the same COVID concept. So are there any industries or maybe companies that you've seen respond particularly well to the COVID disruption? And maybe why do you think that they're doing so well?
Yeah, and I wouldn't characterize it as industries, because industries as a whole, there are good, strong companies within an industry. There are some not very strong players within any industries. But I will say, yes, there are companies who have done exceedingly well in how they had a longer term commitment into supply chain risk and had invested in this pre-COVID, even when risk was not that popular. I mean, I will tell you, after tsunami happened in 2011 and then the Thailand floods, in the high-tech industry, we saw companies really go after supply chain risk and all of that. And then in 16, 17, 18, 19, many of them kind of lost their way a little bit, but some companies didn't. You know, we have many examples of this: IBM, General Motors, Western Digital, Micron. I mean, these are companies I personally work with every day, and their risk programs actually became more mature, grew in capabilities. The people who were doing supply chain risk management were more passionate when the rest of the world was not, and they excelled. I will not say nobody was disrupted. Everybody was disrupted, but it's, you know how it is? It's the muscle memory that you build. We see this time and time again. You know, if you see how the staff at an ER functions, whether it's one ambulance that pulls in or 20 ambulances that pull in, you don't see them panicking. They have a process. They follow the process. They triage, they move, they know where stuff is. It's the muscle memory that kicks in. It's the same for supply chain. You know, you have a program, you have a team, you have a solution. People are trained in using it. They know where to go. They know how to act, how the protocols are, what the triggers are. That muscle memory kicks in, whether it's a COVID or a factory fire or a hurricane or a, you know, bankruptcy. That program and that muscle memory helps. And we see that companies who have invested in this, who have set up those processes and teams and training programs and set up those steering committees and core teams, and they have that cadence, they fared well.
Very good. Yes, I totally agree with you. That's really interesting to hear your view on that. So building on that, we have another, I think, really good student question here. Do you think companies in the post-COVID world will implement and focus more on risk management in the long term, or in the short term simply as an intermediate post-pandemic response? Or how long do you think it'll take those companies to let a risk-focused strategy fall to the wayside? I think you hit on the last piece of this already, right? Where sounds like you're saying like maybe 5 years is what it took last time, 5-6 years.
It did, but then, you know, it was one industry, and the world has changed, right? I mean, we have seen the world of supply chain get scarier and scarier. In 2000, we had Japan tsunami and Thailand floods. And then we had a lot of disruptions, industry specific. But if you're looking at the world today, the disruptions are coming faster and faster. And I don't know if any one of you have picked up the book called The Power of Resilience by Yossi Shafii. But I heard Yossi speak as he launched that book, and it was something he said that really struck me, which was really powerful. He said, you know, what is the worst supply chain disruption you can think of? And in my head, I started thinking, was it the tsunami? This was in, by the way, 2018, okay? So I'm thinking tsunami or the flood, or was it Hurricane Maria or whatnot? What he said was so powerful to me, because what he said was, look, the worst supply chain disruption hasn't happened yet, because the past is bound, the future is unbound. So the worst supply chain disruption is coming. And that was COVID last year. And now we've gone into a world of cybersecurity. I mean, if you just look at the data that Resolink has, which is on cybersecurity, because we track these, this has been the one event that is growing exponentially. And as of 2021 March, this is the biggest threat to the global supply chain, bar none, right? And I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. What we know that's in public domain is just a portion of what's already disrupted. And this is why cybersecurity is so scary. It's because, you know, what could shut down transactions in the virtual world can bring down a completely intact supply chain in the physical world, just because you can't transact a PO, everything gets shut down. So we haven't seen the worst of it. And there will always be some companies who will take this as a way to do a 6-month project, some consulting work, and move on. And hey, future will show, because it's a matter of time, not if, but when.
Absolutely, and I think we've been seeing a lot more, on that cyber piece, where suppliers are actually the ones getting hacked, right? And they don't always have the protection of the major companies, and so then you have to be concerned that you might actually get hacked through, your back doors with your suppliers. So yeah, very, very interesting. I want to hit on this question here because it is a question that references something you already said, but you talked about this idea that we might build supply bases in countries that are more friendly to our country. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. That's really mind expanding to me. But there's this question right here that says, oh, hang on, sorry, it moved down a little bit. So how do we get the US to take a more progressive stance on globalization rather than the America First initiative of the previous administration?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, like I said, it's a re-globalized world. It's not a de-globalized world. I know that we spent 4 years talking about an America First world. The reality is that America First is a pipe dream, because we live in a globalized world that isn't going to change in 10 years, So we can't hope to make that shift happen within 2-3 years or 4 years or 8 years. So really, we are part of an ecosystem, whether we like it or not. The world relies on countries, each other, right? Because that's what 50 years of political strategy has been, is to create a globalized world. So it's not going to become America First even in 10 years. Even if you had Trump for 20 years nonstop, he still could not make it an America First world, because the supply chain is global. And supply chains simply do not re-globalize very quickly. Having said that, we will see some amount of re-globalization happen, and it will be driven by some critical, like I said, critical sectors, where governments band together for certain technology. I mean, we're seeing Biden had another executive order which talks about, hey, technology transfer is prohibited to certain countries where the technology is sensitive or could affect our ability to run our telecom infrastructure, energy infrastructure, certain kinds of things that are critical to our life as we know it to function. So there will be that. Also there are some countries that are banding together as we speak, because there are countries like the US, Japan, Australia, India, and a few others. We have somewhat more of a similar mindset, philosophy, whatever, political leaning, etc. So there will be some amount of countries kind of banding together to make certain joint investments in other countries that are needing help or along the same mindset. So definitely we will see that, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect us to suddenly have everything locally sourced. By the way, before COVID, unemployment in the US, 3.5%, guys. If you built a factory, you couldn't staff it with labor, okay? So let's be clear, they're America First thing, great politics, but not so practical.
Very good. Yeah, thanks, Bindiya. That's really insightful. Actually, so I think kind of building off what we've talked about here a little bit, but where do you see, or what would you envision? Now maybe you've already said this is unknowable, but what do you see as the next big supply chain disruption? I know you mentioned already, you talked a little bit about cyber, right? So I don't know if that's your answer, but please.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say. I would say cyber scares us a lot because you can really come at it. Okay, let me put it this way. What did COVID expose about America or the world in general to the hostile people, countries, whatever, you troublemakers of the world. It showed us that stuff like PPE could bring America to its knees. The Suez Canal is a choke point that could shut down life as we know it. Same with the Panama Canal, that we are very, Texas, hey, we were seconds away from losing the entire power grid in Texas. This last 12 months has exposed our vulnerabilities and the fragility of the supply chain and the dependencies that we have about life as we know it could end that quickly, and what those choke points are. Look at the semiconductor supply chain. 8 companies control that supply chain. Semiconductors go in everything that we buy now. Everything we buy. My coffee machine has it, my shoe has it, I don't know when my hair dryer is gonna get it, but hey, someone's probably building that. My point is, if a malicious interest targets one of these companies or one of these choke points or one of these supply chains, it's very easy to end life as we know it for a period of time. And that can easily happen with cybersecurity. Because it's so easy to sit there virtually controlling the world, and so many companies have company name 123 as their password. In fact, that's how SolarWinds happened, right? Is that there was somebody with that kind of a SolarWinds 123 type of a password, which is how the hackers got in. And these types of data leaks are happening. We just don't know about it. So I would say that if someone asked me today, I would say cybersecurity is extremely scary because it can be done in a very targeted way at a vulnerable key point, and it would really have a huge impact on humanity and on supply chains. And supply chains are life, Our life is powered by supply chain.
Absolutely. And that's become more apparent recently, right? When this pandemic hit, suddenly all my relatives were texting me, asking me where they could get toilet paper. I was like, I'm not a toilet paper expert, but they know I do supply chain. So they figure that's that I would know, right? But so building off that, I think, well, not off toilet paper necessarily, but is there a particular event that has happened in the past that you think supply chains were able to learn from? We're hoping that everyone learns from COVID and that our supply chain knowledge improves. Is there an event previously that's happened that you viewed as particularly sort of, I don't know, knowledge expanding to the supply chain world?
Absolutely. There were multiple, actually. Yossi Sheffi's first book came in 2005. That's what exposed me to this world of supply chain, which was the big Phillips fire, which was actually not a big fire. And if you look at the news last week on the Wall Street Journal, we are literally repeating history with the Renaissance factory fire that damaged 23 pieces of equipment. The Phillips fire was actually smaller than that. It only had smoke damage in a clean room, and it shaped the outcome of Nokia versus Ericsson and how the two companies responded. One ended up having to exit the handset market, $400 million impact to revenue and all of that. So that was, I think, the disruption that actually kind of started my personal journey. But goodness, my personal journey has been shaped by multiple earthquakes in Taiwan, Chengdu earthquake, the swine flu pandemic, the bankruptcies of 2008, the Japan tsunami, the Iceland volcano, 9/11, and all the logistics shutdowns, the Long Beach port strike, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey, the Texas freeze. I mean, I can keep going. Laura last year, Sandy. So it's been unbelievable. And now COVID, and just look at just last 12 months. I just, honestly, if you're not learning, you don't want it.
Yeah. Yes, fair enough. And that's also the first supply chain risk case I ever read as well, that Nokia versus Ericsson one. I still teach it to my class.
It's a great case study. And this is exactly right now what's happening with Renaissance, the factory fire that happened. The CEO came out last week and said 4 months to recovery. Well, let me tell you, they have 23 pieces of equipment damaged. It takes 12 to 16 weeks minimum just to replace or repair equipment in the semiconductor industry. Not to mention that equipment has to be requalified. A qual sample run has to happen. All the customers have to approve this new equipment and say, okay, these parts work, and then the production run happens. This is a 12-month disruption coming on top of an already constrained semiconductor industry. So unbelievable what is going on right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know, I said the same thing when I saw that article. I was like, oh, this is just like Nokia and Ericsson all over again.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
Students who are using Resolink, guys, you use the full recovery time. This is full recovery time happening right here in action, which is, hey, how long does it take you to return to pre-disruption run rate? It's not just when can you get a fab back operational, which is the 4-month period. I'm going to replace the equipment and I'll get my fab operational. No, when can you get back to pre-disruption run rate? If that fab was producing 1 million pieces that customers were willing to buy, that's your pre-disruption run rate. And that can't happen just because you opened the fab. That fab has to be requalified. Scary.
Very interesting. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, indeed. I would, if you don't mind, I would like to switch to some entrepreneurship related questions, because we have a series of those that have come in, and obviously we have a large entrepreneurship program here. So I wouldn't mind shifting over to that, unless you have something else you'd like to say about supply chain risk before I make this shift.
I could talk for supply chain risk for 7 more hours, but entrepreneurship now.
I'm pretty sure we only have an hour, so I'm sorry. But so what were some of the biggest hurdles you faced in founding your company?
Look, my journey is no different than any entrepreneur, right? You have, I will say that a lot of time people worry about, well, somebody will steal my idea and they don't talk about it. Forget about that. That will happen. It's going to happen. Deal with it. Go talk about it, right? So I did that. I talked about it with anyone. If you sat next to me on a plane, I could tell you about supply chain risk for the next hour until you wanted me to shut up. But I talked to anyone who would listen. And it was the biggest challenge that any entrepreneur has is getting customers, getting employees, getting investors. That's it, right? But I will tell you, get customers, everyone else will follow. If you have customers, you will get people. If you have customers, you will get investors. Focus on customers. Is somebody feeling the pain that you're solving and is willing to pay to buy your solution? That's all people need to know. If somebody's willing to pay, you'll be able to hire employees. And if you're able to satisfy your customers and get more customers, you will get investors. But that's really the 3 things: customers, employees, and investors.
Mm-hmm. Very good. That's interesting, and that makes sense to me. So this is maybe supply chain / entrepreneurship, but it's another student question. So from an entrepreneurial perspective, do you see any opportunities in supply chain?
Lots of opportunities. In fact, I will say this, supply chain, after the dot-com bust, when the dot-com bust happened in 2001, a lot of the Silicon Valley VCs lost money on their supply chain investments. And so there went this huge dearth of investment in this area for the next 10 years. So here comes Bindiya in 2010 thinking, I'm going to start a supply chain company. I go start pitching to Silicon Valley venture investors and angels, and they're like listening to me do my pitch. 30 minutes later, yeah, we just don't invest in supply chain. Okay, so let me tell you, I beat my head against that wall for 2 years, ended up I'm based in Silicon Valley, not $1 of my first 3 rounds came from Silicon Valley investors. I raised it all from outside because Silicon Valley wasn't interested in investing in supply chain. So fast forward 10 years later, they've learned that this is an area that is rife and good for investing now. And so it's opened up a lot more. And you will see that there's tons of opportunity because the area has been underinvested in. Definitely. And there are lots of problems to solve in supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes sense. So then you're talking about some of the, I think, challenges that you've had. And I think this next question is another student question, but it's very relevant there. So what are some of the obstacles in your career that you've had to overcome as a woman and a person of color?
Yeah, not being taken seriously, being patronized, and people think they can walk all over me. And it has been very difficult. I will say that I've had to stand up for myself, walk away from bad money. There is such a thing. And don't take it. It'll be harder, but there is somebody else who will invest in you in future. Believe that and keep pushing. I've had, you know, in my experience, and someone told me when I started Resolink this, Bindiya, you will have to do 30 pitches before you get investments. Okay, so I said, okay, fine, 30 pitches, got it. Doing my thing, 30 no's, 35, 40. Okay, I'm doing something wrong, 50. 55, 62, every time more than 60, okay? 5 rounds of investment later, 60 pitches every time. And that's not just 60 pitches. That is each person I pitch to, some of them will go to 3 meetings, 5 meetings before they'll say no. So I'm counting 60 unique. My point to you is entrepreneurship is hard, but don't let the no's bring you down because everybody will say no. All you need is one yes. And that one yes will happen. You know who makes the difference between the yes versus give up versus stay? It's you. The day I give up is the day Resolink fails. Until I don't give up, I'm the CEO of Resolink. Resolink's alive. So if you're going for it, go all in and don't let the no's bring you down.
Thanks, Bindiya. That's excellent advice to all of us, even those of us who aren't entrepreneurs. So I do have one more question for you that I think is particularly, well, obviously everyone in this audience should want to get into supply chain risk management right now, right? So we've had a question, if a student does want to get into the supply chain risks field, how would you suggest they do that?
Yeah, okay, so this is a good one. By the way, Resolink is hiring. So if you're looking, I always love to say this to students, especially, you know, we love the whole working with the universities and love that. But feel free to apply to Resolink through our webpage. But a lot of companies right now are creating roles for supply chain risk management program manager. So look for program manager or supply chain risk analyst type of roles. And I will tell you, this is the one role that you will see more and more of. A lot of companies have either already created it, or I know a lot of them have started looking or planning to. So look for that title in your searches.
Great. And actually, one student has a follow-up question that I know I promised that would be my last question, but I think this is relevant. So what is Resolink looking for? What do you guys look for when you hire?
Yeah, you know, we look for, do you care? We look for passion, right? Someone who wants to do this because they think supply chain risk is the right thing to do, that they get motivated and passionate about it, will see this through thick and thin. And I will tell you, in Resolink's life, we've seen a lot of ups and downs, particularly downs when the world did not believe that this was a space worth investing in. And my team stuck with me through that time. Why? Not because they believe in me, but because they believe in our mission, you know, our purpose. Our purpose is we're improving the supply chains that power life. We're making them more resilient, sustainable, fair, and secure. If that's what you are passionate about and you believe your work can make a difference, this is the right place for you.
Very good. Thank you, Bindiya. Thanks for coming and just having this chat with us. I think I've learned a lot. I'm sure the students have too. It's always great talking to you. So I really do appreciate you coming and sharing your wisdom with us.
No, thank you. And thank you all for listening, for lots of questions. I enjoyed that a lot. And yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, visit the website, apply to jobs, and just stay connected with, follow Resolink. No matter where you go, make a difference, make the world a more resilient place. Thank you and best of luck.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bindiya. And please, all the students, remember that you can put in, or please do remember to put in your class as well as your the professor who you're attending this seminar for, so that way you can get credit for it if your professor's offering credit for it. So thank you again. We'll see you.